Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm starting this a little bit early. I figured, what the heck? The premiere is over now on the main Stated Clearly channel. Hope you liked that. I am here to answer questions that you might have about evolution. I'm going to spend an hour on here, roughly. So it's 9:30 right now, according to my computer, and we'll go till 10:30. Send me your questions and have all your questions do at stated space casually so that I see them in the comments. And, if you want, you can always do a super chat. I do accept super chats. And, yeah, so I'm gonna wait for a couple of questions to come in. Looks like I just got one. I'm gonna wait for a couple of questions to come in. While I do that, I'm gonna roll on over to. I'm gonna scroll on over back to Chloe's Instagram. I don't know how many people saw that during the live show today, so I want to make sure you see that. This is the Instagram page called Tardy Babe. It's by Chloe. She's in Montreal, which, fairly close to where I'm at. And she makes these amazing videos, just little microbiology videos in her microscope that are seriously amazing. I mean, she posts every day. And if you subscribe to her channel, you will be blessed with just constant. This stuff is nuts. She has, I've got a microscope, but it doesn't look this cool when I look at my microscope. She's got all these cool filters and different light settings and stuff. And, she's good at, she's got some pond water, and she's really good at finding the different organisms in there. She knows what all of them are. I don't know any of this stuff. I learned from her. There's a couple of other Instagram people. There's Jam and Germs, which is also really good. I recommend that one. But yeah, her stuff is amazing. Seriously, like right now, go follow her on Instagram if you have an Instagram account. Go follow me too. I'm stated clearly. I'm on Instagram. I don't post that often there right now. I probably should do that more often. But yeah, this stuff is cool. Let me zoom in so you can see it better. These things are mating, actually, which is cool. They're single-celled organisms that mate. They exchange genes with one another. Eukaryotes. So the bacteria and stuff are a lot smaller than this. I think maybe some of these things in the background here might be bacteria. But yeah, I'm not the right person to ask about that. This one's really cool. It's like a landscape. Yeah, she's got every time she also posts, a message in there for us, and it's always cool. She's talking about the organisms. Sometimes she'll tell you how she got the shot, what filter she's using. Here we got a tardy bear. Really cool stuff. So yeah, go follow her. It's amazing. All right, let me get to some of these questions now. I'm getting a dropped warning. Some of these frames I guess are getting dropped, but that's okay. Let's see. Question. Evolution is still the hot topic for the anti-science movement in many places. Have you ever been faced with that? Have you ever had to school someone on the spot because you believed? Well, yeah, so I have, on the spot. Most of what I do is videos. So I upload a video and then people complain about it in the comment section. But I do classroom visits as well. And whenever I visit a classroom, I'll get, at pretty much every class that I visit, I'll have someone who is wanting, they're asking a lot of questions, or they're just trying to disrupt the lesson in a way that you can tell that, yeah, that they're definitely, there's some anti-evolution stuff in their heads. But in the classroom, it never gets out of hand. Like, we just talk about it, and I've always been able to settle it just fine, or at least tell them where they can learn more. I direct people a lot to the BioLogos website. BioLogos is a website. It's an evangelical Christian website where they do, they're evangelical Christians that are trying to find a way to make it so that Christians can accept the science of evolution. Because it's just this horrible holdup that Christians have. Not all Christians, obviously. Lots of Christians are fine with evolution, but there's this problem where students just have trouble learning this, and they feel really stressed out during biology class because they think that this theory must somehow invalidate their faith. So that's a constant problem that you have when you do lectures in classrooms, and it's definitely a constant problem that you have when you teach on the internet. So my comment sections are just filled with anti-evolution stuff, and I don't usually deal with it really. There are other people that comment and they'll fight with creationists. It's not really something I'm that interested in doing. I have done debates actually on this channel, on the State of Casualty channel. I had Rob Stadler on, and he's really anti-evolution, particularly anti-origin of life science. And we talked about that. And I actually did a debate right at the start of my career back in 2012 with a radio show host, Steve Gregg. And there's a video of that somewhere on the internet of my debate with Steve Gregg. But I like doing that. It's fun. I think that stuff is fun. So let's see. Am I not getting questions, or are they just not coming to me through my program here? So yeah, if you want to ask a question, do @stated_casually, and I'll make sure to see it in the comments. And I'm just checking here to make sure that everything's streaming through. Okay, here we go. Here's stuff coming in. Here's kind of, it's not really a question, I don't think, but okay. I loved what you said about if you don't trust science, just try it for yourself. Sometimes I feel like we are losing curious minds to the other side of the force just by being kind of cocky. Yeah, I agree with that. This is also true with, like flat Earth, and there's the anti-vaccine movement as well. With things like the anti-vaccine movement, it's kind of hard to test it without taking a vaccine, like test it for yourself. So I think in some cases you really do have to trust experts to some degree, but you can really dive in and look at the research yourself. You can look at, what's been done with flat Earth. You can actually just redo the experiments that were done by the ancient, what is it? I can't remember who it was that figured out that the Earth was round. Is that the experiment done, I think, in Greece? But yeah, we can, people don't have to trust experts all the time. Like, we can actually do science ourselves. And yeah, I think it's really fun. Martin Henning. Why is there not massive amount of junk code in DNA because of random mutations? If you randomly mutate or add computer code, you would get lots of junk code. Well, there are lots of like pseudogenes and things in our DNA. You probably heard, some people have probably heard of the ENCODE project, which has tried to figure out how much of our genome is doing something. And it turns out that a huge chunk of our genome is doing something. We knew in the past that the protein coding genes were doing something, but that was only like 1% of the genome. And some people said, oh, maybe the rest is just junk DNA. The ENCODE project found out that almost all of the genome is being used, but a lot of the stuff that it's being used for is really interesting. Like, there are big chunks of our DNA that come from viruses, and there are big chunks of our DNA that have evolved to do nothing but suppress those chunks of virus DNA. So there's actual conflict. They call it intergenome conflict. So the huge chunks of our genome just exist to fight other chunks of the genome, stop them from doing things that are going to damage the cell that's hosting them, which is hilarious. There's a literal gene wars happening inside of your cells all the time. A bunch of our genes in the main compartment of in the nucleus are trying to control the mitochondria, which are their own little segments of a cell that have their own genes. And mitochondria can get out of hand. They can start exploiting the cell, and they're in a symbiotic relationship with their host cell. They actually originally evolved from bacteria, but we actually pass them on from parent to child. The mother passes her mitochondria onto her child through her egg. And these are little microbes that live inside of our cells, and a huge chunk of our genome is dedicated to stopping them from misbehaving. So we actually have pulled some of their genes out of them over evolutionary time, and they're held in the nucleus, and we can actually control their replication so they don't just get out of hand inside of the cell. It's really fascinating when you see all the chaos that's happening inside the human genome. There's a really cool paper where you can read about this called The Genome Strikes Back, and it's about viral genes and other parasitic genes that we have in our own genome. Some of them actually got there through virus infections. And then all the different things that have evolved to stop those genes from trying to do what they're trying to do. It's really cool. So there's actually, I don't know if you would call that junk DNA, but there's just a lot of chaos in our genome. You said, let's see, if you randomly mutate computer code, you would get lots of junk code. The way to relate the human genome to computer code, like there is a way that you can relate the two. The codon chart that the genetic code is based on is very similar to machine code, like the machine code charts that you'll find, which like things like ASCII. But the way that the genetic code functions is actually very, very different from computer code, and it evolved. And so it's actually, it accrued its, content over millions of years of evolution. And so the way that mutations affect genomes, they don't cause horrible chaos in those genomes. The whole system evolved with mutations being a part of the system. So if you wanted to compare it to computer coding systems, I think you'd probably have to compare it to some of the AI systems that we have now that are supposed to mutate randomly. So these, what are they called? The neural networks. They have a random component to them which changes the code. And it changes the code in a way that doesn't break the whole system. And those work really similarly to how the genetic code works. I mean, mutations are actually a feature, not a bug, in the genetic code and in these neural net computer learning programs. So I hope that answers your question. So in short, let me just summarize that though. Pretty much the entire genome does something. Some things are just stretches of DNA, and it's the length that matters, not the actual sequence. So the sequence might not be important, but the length is important. Some things are just duplicates. And actually, if you compare the genome of any two humans, they could have somewhere between 1 and 5 million more or less nucleotides than the other person. So there is a lot of junk. I mean, there's things that you can just completely delete and nothing changes. Seriously, like one person to another, their genome might be different in length by 5 million nucleotides. That's not unusual. And it's not because one person has some sort of disability. It's just there's lots of insertions and deletions happening all the time. But a lot of the genes, a lot of the non-protein coding parts of our genome, all they're doing is they're suppressing other parts of the genome that are trying to act up. So it's, the genome is way more interesting than we originally thought. Let's see. Have you ever, George Jacobs asks, have you ever applied the reasoning of theory of evolution to the future of artificial general intelligence? Does it terrify you just as much as it does me. Uh, yeah. So one of the funny things I've heard, Neil deGrasse Tyson went on TV saying that we shouldn't worry about AI because if AI gets out of hand, we'll just turn it off. Well, we know that AI can act up because our brains are artificial intelligence systems designed by our genes. And our genes, they evolved these brains. Through the process of evolution, they ended up building these brains. And the selection pressure to build the human brain was to help the genes survive and reproduce. But these brains have now taken on goals of their own, and we do things like we use condoms and we, careful family planning and all this stuff. We do a bunch of things that if our genes were capable of knowing what we were doing, they're not. They're just chemicals. But if they were capable of knowing what we're doing, they would be very much alarmed with our behavior. And if you just take that as a basic example of, will AI act up? Will it misbehave? Probably. I mean, once it already kind of is. We have AI systems that promote different YouTube channels over other ones. We have AI systems that promote things on social media and so on. And what we found is that these AI systems, they end up promoting things that get you to stay on the website longer. And it turns out that oftentimes conspiracy theories make you stay on YouTube longer than other types of videos. And violent and aggressive, things that are mean-hearted tend to keep you on Facebook longer or on Twitter longer. And so the algorithms, these AIs, are actually already screwing us over. They're already doing what we don't want them to do. They're promoting hatred. They're promoting really bad ideas. And so YouTube has just been running like crazy. Google is running like crazy to try and, figure out what these AIs are doing and try to make it so they stop promoting conspiracy theories and hate on YouTube. So that is pretty interesting. I think that as AIs get stronger and more capable, that problem is just going to continue to get worse and worse and worse until we're just, it can be really bad in the future. Some say that this might be worse than nuclear weapons, or has the potential to be worse than nuclear weapons. So that's a pretty big deal. Stated clearly, are nipples for males classified as junk code? I don't know. I think, we all start out, that humans all start out as really a sex neutral fetus, and the genes from the Y chromosome kick in. I can't remember which day it is during development, but it's several days in, and start adding male type parts. And if that Y chromosome is not there, then you develop female type parts. And so any part that a female has, a male will tend to have as well, but they're just slight changes. So you actually, the uterus ends up dissolving in males. We actually start to develop one, but then it goes away. I guess nipples could have done that too, because we don't really need them, right? They're just like kind of a source for, getting tumors, really. Men get breast cancer still. It's not super common, but men do get breast cancer. So I guess you could say that it's just kind of junk code. It's something that just hasn't disappeared over evolutionary time. So, yeah, I guess. There are stories, though. This hasn't been confirmed recently in modern science, but there are stories of men breastfeeding. If you look back at Roman literature, where there's some scenario where the wife died and the man was able to actually start producing milk and was breastfeeding. And those stories are really interesting. Who knows if they're true, first of all, because we haven't been able to confirm that in modern times. You can do it with hormone treatment. You can actually get a man to produce milk and breastfeed, but that takes hormonal intervention. But we have these reports in the past of this happening. And maybe this could happen if you were, some people are intersex, and so they're not fully male or fully female, they're somewhere in between. And that could maybe happen. So you might be able to father a child and breastfeed a child. That'd be interesting. I haven't heard of those cases, but so maybe you could say that nipples should have gone away, but there are cases where they come in handy still. So yeah. RJ says, I have a hard time accepting that random mutation alone drive variation that randomly fit an ecological niche. Is there another hypothesis out there that explains how organisms find a way to be selected by nature? Well, it really is. Descent with modification acted upon by selection is the it's what we see when we actually observe nature. But there are some things that are a little bit different than that. So, for example, animals migrate to climates that are suitable for the traits that they happen to have. So that's one way that you can kind of control your own evolution. Another way that you can kind of control your own evolution is by selecting a mate that doesn't have, selecting a healthy mate. So sexual reproduction speeds up the evolutionary process dramatically. For one reason, you can choose your mate to a degree. I mean, you might not have all the options you wish, but you can choose your own mate. And then also there is genetic crossover that happens when mating, and this actually speeds up evolution in sexual reproducing animals dramatically. You have the traits of two individuals who can mate. To be old enough to mate, you have to have survived, childhood. You have to be fairly well adapted. And now when you mate, the chromosomes of the male and the female, they come together and they actually switch genes with each other. And then it's basically like they shuffle their traits together. And so then you'll get offspring that some of the offspring have the best traits of both of those parents. Some of the offspring have the worst traits of both of those parents. But you get this spread in the offspring. And so that actually speeds up evolution quite a bit as well. So it is kind of a random process, but it's more, I guess, more controlled than total randomness. And actually, any mutation's it's not total randomness. There's only 4 nucleotides. So when a point mutation occurs, there's only so many possibilities. It's not like there's infinite possibilities. So there's quite a few constraints on what types of mutations are possible. And then mutations that are really bad usually kill a fetus before the mother even knows she's pregnant. So there's actually a huge amount of natural selection already happening before we're even born. So all of this comes into play to make it so that really these random changes, they can produce quite spectacular outcomes. John Brummel asked, did I already do one from you? Hold on. No. Could you explain gene activation? Earlier you stated that white blood cells contain our entire genome. What principles or mechanisms activate these unique portions? So I actually know most about this from bacteria, but it does work in fairly similar ways. These are what we call epigenetic changes that happen during development. So a lot of times these days when people talk about epigenetics, they're talking about certain epigenetic changes that might be passed on to offspring. And that's actually really controversial as to how much that can actually happen. We don't think it can happen that much. But the original literature on epigenetics was all about how it is that cells differentiate during development. So how do you go from an amoeboid type cell to a skin cell, for example, or from what do they call them? A stem cell to a skin cell, or a stem cell to an amoeboid cell. So we start out with very generic cells in the embryo. We call them stem cells. And those, by signaling to each other, cells actually, they tell each other what to do, essentially, what to transform into. And if you look at bacteria, they're doing this. The first the first case of this that was figured out was in bacteria, that a type of bacteria that can digest lactose. But when there's no lactose in their environment, the genes that code for the enzymes that digest the lactose are turned off. They don't make them. They don't bother wasting all their energy producing these special enzymes that can digest lactose. Instead, they just produce the ones that digest normal sugars and whatever happens to be in their environment. And this was right after World War II. I'm forgetting the name of the guy, French guy, Monod, I want to say, who figured this out with one of his war buddies. They started doing research after the war on bacteria. And they found out that there is another protein that attaches to the gene that codes for the lactose enzyme. And that protein has a part of it that if lactose comes into the cell, it will stick to that protein. And the protein will respond by tweaking in a certain way that makes it fall off the DNA. And now that gene that codes for the lactose enzyme is available for essentially for the ribosome to turn into protein. So you've got a protein that silences the gene by sitting on the gene, literally sitting on the gene in the genome of this bacteria. And there's a trigger that causes it to fall off, and that trigger is lactose. And this system is very similar to the systems that we have in our own cells that turn off certain genes and turn on certain other genes. Instead of lactose being the thing that turns a gene on, cells signal to each other. There's all these signal gradients in an embryo as it's developing. And according to who you're next to and how many of these signals they're sending out, those are going to determine what type of cell you end up being. And so all of this happens by intercellular communication through these networks. It's really cool. But that's how we get genes to turn off and genes to turn on. And over evolutionary time, you can get really crazy complex signaling and really complex morphological changes that are possible. So this cell that we looked at in the video over on the Stated Clearly channel, that thing, if it can tell that it can't swim, there's some sort of sensor that it has, and we don't know what the sensor is, that unleashes a bunch of genes that would otherwise be turned off. It transforms its body into an amoeboid type body, and it can pull itself out of whatever it's pinched between, and then it can develop its flagellum again and swim away. So that's really cool. I'm going through questions here. Again, if you do @stated_casually, some people are doing stated clearly. On this channel, that doesn't show up for me. So if you do @stated_casually, I'll see your question. Let's see, questions. JJ asked another one. I'll try and get to that later. He asked if humans stopped evolving because of medicine and vaccines. So if I don't get to that, remind me again. I want to get to some other people's questions because you've already asked one, but that is a cool question. Kevin Lobo says, I just want to thank you for getting me inspired to pursue a career in science. Oh, awesome. I'm a third semester student on my biotechnology career, and your channel was a big influence. Greetings from Bolivia. Oh, that's awesome. Which channel was it? Was it Stated Clearly or Stated Casually that got you interested? That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that with me. Let's see. What would the next species of human be called? Oh, well, I have no clue. In order to speciate, usually you have to get a population that splits in two. I mean, well, you can have speciation linearly over time. So if an entire population just changes in morphology enough, eventually you might want to call it a new species. But the way that species evolve normally is a population will split in two, and the two different populations will have different selection pressures. And if they stay physically separated long enough, they will evolve far enough from each other that when they come back together, they can no longer interbreed and successfully have offspring. And it's really hard to think that humans might be able to do that in the future, unless, of course, we go to Mars or something. Because what's happening right now is our species is becoming more and more connected, so that there's gene flow, much better gene flow across human populations than there ever has been in the past. So I find it unlikely that a new species of human will pop up anytime soon. But maybe once we start doing interplanetary colonization, then, you could have groups of humans that, colonies of humans that never interact with each other, maybe even for millions of years, if we start traveling far enough. And what would you call them? I don't know. But we could get some really unique morphology to evolve. That assumes that we don't kill ourselves with nuclear weapons or AI or viruses or something first. Okay. Could DNA code and nanomolecular machines and factories in our bodies be alien technology? I suppose they could, but you need to demonstrate that, and it's not been demonstrated. So the most likely explanation is that life emerged on Earth, and that, So to say that it was aliens or something else, you would have to show what those aliens were like, how they did it, and so on. Right now, origin of life researchers are working to figure out how the chemistry on the early Earth did it. That's what we suspect did it. It's just, it emerged from the chemistry of the early Earth. So they're working really hard to do that. I've not seen anyone do any serious work on aliens or, really, I haven't seen anyone try anything else. There are not competing research programs. The only actual real research going on the origin of life is centered around the idea that life emerged from chemistry. Let's see. Explain variability hypothesis. I'm not sure. There's a lot of things that could be. That particular name I haven't heard before, but there's the idea that evolution is helped out by phenotypic plasticity, and I've actually been talking about phenotypic plasticity in these cyanoflagellates. They can behave as amoebas or they can behave as flagellates, depending on the circumstances of their environment. They have the DNA to do both, and when circumstances are right, they switch body form. Maybe that's what you're talking about with variability hypothesis. So if not, let me know. I'm going to go back to that question that I had skipped earlier from JJ. That was pretty good. So he asked, are humans done evolving because of medicine and vaccines? And no, we're definitely not done evolving. We can now, the selection pressures on us have changed. They've loosened quite a bit, but only for people with access to modern medicine, right? There's still massive selection pressures even for people with modern medicine before you're born, right? There's not a whole lot we can do for a fetus that's got a genetic disorder. But for things like bad eye, I have horrible eyesight. I have to wear contact lenses. My prescription is -9. So, yeah, I am greatly helped by modern medicine. I would probably be dead. Actually, I would have died. I tried to count this one time. I think I'd be dead 4 times if it weren't for modern medicine. I'd be dead because I'm blind, probably. Depends on how cool my tribe was or my group was that want to help a blind man. I would be dead before I was born because I was an emergency C-section. I would be dead probably from breaking my arm when I was 15. I snapped my arm in half. And So that was, I mean, people live through that, obviously, but it was a really, really bad break. I definitely could have died from that. I certainly wouldn't have been able to use my left arm again, and I'm left-handed, so I would have been very much disabled the rest of my life. And then I probably would have been dead when I was 18. I had Guillain-Barré, and I was a quadriplegic for a week. And I had to have help with everything. And if it weren't for modern medicine, I probably would have died from that. A lot of people used to die from that. Their lungs would just stop working, and their heart would stop beating. So I lived through that. So yeah, modern medicine has definitely made me survive longer than I would have otherwise. So it's definitely loosening selection pressures. But again, most of the world, I think it's over half of the world doesn't have access to medicine at all. And then a huge chunk of the world that does have access to it doesn't have good access to it. Like even in America, people don't have good access to healthcare. So it's not slowing us down that much. But then what it is doing is it's allowing genetic diversity to increase in our genome, and it will continue to increase. And in some populations, they'll actually become weaker. We're going to have poorer eyesight in civilized nations than you do in non-civilized, places without glasses. I shouldn't say non-civilized. They're civilized. They're just civilized differently. But you do have this, this collection of disabilities, I guess you could say, that are accruing in certain populations. But really what that does is it just adds genetic diversity that when there's another big selection event, natural selection will whittle us down again to a population. And maybe the bad eyesight genes that I have, if those are mixed with the right genes from somebody else, it'll actually give someone better eyesight than the typical phenotype might. Like, you cannot predict these things. It's crazy what happens when different genes end up in the same being through sexual reproduction. You have this swapping of genes that happens on the chromosomes and the genetic crossover, and that can cause unique combinations. And the more genetic diversity you have in a population, the better you are when there's a disaster, when there's a huge selection event. So I don't think that this slowing down because of the relaxing of selection pressures because of medicine, I don't think it's going to end up being a bad thing. It's just letting us increase genetic diversity. We don't know what the future will hold. When we're hit with a new selection event, our population will be whittled down again. We might lose modern medicine, in which case, that it'll be really rough for people. But natural selection will end up finding what the best fit in that new environment is, and we will continue onward. So I don't think it's a problem. And it's not really slowing down our evolution that much. As I said, huge chunks of the population do not have access to modern medicine. Okay. Okay, I've got, if evolution is true, why do apes, chimps still exist? Or why don't we see chimps turning into humans? I hate to do that to you, but it's such a common misunderstanding. So, humans and chimps evolved from a common ancestor. We did not evolve directly from chimps. And I had mentioned this earlier. Well, actually, one of the best responses to this question is, if America started out as a British colony, how come Britain still exists? And, why is England still a thing? And the reason, of course, is that populations split in two, and then those two populations evolved down separate pathways. But, the new one doesn't erase the original one, not by default. I mean, we probably actually will eventually erase chimpanzees because we're encroaching on their habitat. But, generally, the two just evolve side by side for a while until one goes extinct. So, yeah, that's why. And why don't we see chimps turning into humans? Well, chimps are evolving down their own pathways, and we would not expect to watch them evolve as much as it took. It took millions of years to develop humans from their common ancestor with chimps, and so we don't expect to be able to just watch that happen again in chimps right away, and we don't even expect that it would happen again. I mean, evolution it's crazy. It can go down any pathway. You can't predict it. You can predict it a little bit, but not well enough to say that, oh, chimps will someday evolve into human-like organisms. AJ Rana or Ajrana says, how some traits become dominant and some get recessive, how it's decided. And what about new mutation, which are even better? Do they also become dominant later? So the dominant and recessive, it actually comes down to just chemical consequences. Something can be dominant. Whether or not something is dominant doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's good for the organism or bad for the organism. It's just there are lots of different chemical characteristics that cause something to be dominant or recessive. So, for example, white flowers, if there's a species of plant that has, some individuals have white flowers, some have purple flowers. White flowers are usually a broken pigment gene. So there's a purple pigment gene in the flower, but it's broken, and that's why it produces white. If you have just one of those genes that's not broken, it'll produce purple. And that's because the white is actually generated by not producing any pigment at all. So if you have at least one of these genes that is functioning, it turns out purple. That's how it's dominant. It has nothing to do with whether or not it's good for the plant. It's just, if you have no pigment, it turns white. If you have some pigment, it turns out purple in this case. So the albino genes are recessive, because if you have at least one skin pigment gene, you won't be albino. You'll be, you'll have color to your skin. So JJ asked, do mixed races have higher chances of genetic mutation? No, races are just names that we've given to populations of humans. Some races have adaptations where, historically, if you go back and look at the people that lived in specific environments, some of their traits are actual adaptations to their local environment. So darker skin pigments in sunnier areas, that's an adaptation. And there are a bunch of other adaptations, like the people that live in Arctic regions, they will be adapted a lot of times to diets that are extremely high in fat. They can process really high meat diets and high fat diets a lot better than other people can, because that's like during winter, you do nothing but eat animals and like blubber and stuff. So there are some adaptations that you might say are, associated with races, but the concept of race is really, we use it horribly. It's not a biological concept, really. So, like in America, if someone is just slightly dark, a lot of times they're considered to be a black race, and that's not how genetics actually works. Biologists care about populations, and if you mix two people from different populations, generally you actually have healthier offspring. That your chances of inbreeding, for example, are way lower. So, because they're diversely different populations. So no, there's not higher mutations. It's usually tends to work out better, actually. How do behaviors evolve? I assume that most behaviors happen because an individual started doing something as a habit, but how does that habit get passed down? P.S. Love the channel. We don't really understand how behaviors are encoded in the genome, but it is definitely clear that behaviors can be inherited. It's really obvious that behaviors can be inherited, because you can breed them into dogs, for example. And that we just don't know enough about the brain to be able to answer that really well. But a lot of behaviors are definitely innate. If you look at a beaver, for example, if you raise a beaver in captivity without access to, anyone to teach it how to build a dam, they will start building dams. They'll start trying to, if you put them in the water, and they'll get at it. They're not very good at it if they haven't learned, but they definitely have some instincts that are helping them do that. They're obsessed with dam building. And of course, humans have all sorts of, like, we're inclined to, we know how to breastfeed right out of the gate. We're inclined to recognize faces. We're really interested in faces. We're interested in speech when we're really young. And these are natural interests that we have that they're really, really strong. They're not, you can't say that humans are blank slates and they learn everything. We are obsessed with very specific things from a very early age, and that enables us to learn how to interact with our particular cultures. So, yeah, sorry, I didn't really answer your question very well there. Because it's not actually super well understood. Maybe there's someone who knows something that I haven't read about yet, but this is something I've been curious about and I've been trying to keep up on the literature. So, yeah, let me know if you know of anything that I missed there, but it's a good question. Sorry, just reading here. This is the part of the podcast where I silently read to myself. Why do single-stranded RNA viruses such as coronavirus evolve faster than, I assume, than DNA viruses? It's not necessarily the case, but it tends to be the case because DNA is just less stable, so mutations are more likely. The coronavirus is it's a single-stranded RNA virus, though. It's only got one stretch of genetic information. The flu can evolve even faster because it's got multiple stretches, and so you can actually have this shuffling that happens when two viruses infect the same cell. They'll actually shuffle their genes, just like sexual reproduction. Coronavirus can do a very similar thing. But it's a little bit trickier, like physically how it happens. But essentially, the chains of RNA are just less stable than chains of DNA. And because of that, you have a higher mutation rate, and that can cause faster mutation. It can also make it easier to kill a virus through mutational meltdown. You can get, if you can actually just poke it to evolve even faster than it's evolved to evolve, then it's capable of evolving. Most things have a certain threshold of mutation rate per generation. If you go beyond that, they will spiral out of control. And so there's some people that are thinking maybe we could do this with the coronavirus because it seems to be skating right on that edge. But we'll see. I think people try to do that with HIV as well, and it hasn't worked. HIV is skating right on the edge of mutational meltdown, but you just can't push it over. It just won't go. So hopefully that answered your question. RNA evolves faster because it's less stable than DNA. Deconverted Man says, didn't they recently say that a group of apes had entered the Stone Age? I seem to recall hearing that, but I don't remember the details. Apes use stones. They build tools, all sorts of tools. We didn't think that they used to. We didn't used to think that they did, but we now know that they do. And even monkeys will. So, yeah, Stone Age, I suppose. But they're not like, creating really nice obsidian spear tips and stuff, but they are using stones as weapons. Let's see. Have you had your DNA sequenced, either something like 21andMe or the full genome sequence? I have not. It would be kind of cool to do that though, because I have a twin brother. It'd be fun to both do it, and we could test to see how accurate they are. But yeah, I have not done that. Let's see. Do we have any ideas of what biological molecules might look like if, for example, it is silicon-based rather than carbon, or is liquid methane as the solvent rather than water? There have been experiments where people try to make a cell membrane with molecules that might exist on the moon Titan. And I can't remember what it's based on, but it's not water. It's yeah, I can't remember what the chemistry is, but it's completely different. So yeah, people have done that. I don't, like, off the top of my head, I couldn't even tell you what the names of the molecules were, but I'm pretty sure they were simulating Titan. So if you want to dig in on Google, that would be where I'd start. Titan, cell membrane, something like that. But yeah, people have done that. Is artificial intelligence doing a reverse evolution? I don't really know what you would mean by that. Yeah, explain a little bit more what you mean by that, and I'll try and answer that. YouTube user Yes asks, do viruses steal information from its host? I mean, it's not really intentional, but by accident, yes. Sometimes a virus will package up other bits of genetic material that are not part of the virus, and you can actually get horizontal gene transfer that way between species. You can get a gene from a bat into a human through this process. If the a bat virus gets into a human, and then if you have like a retrovirus like HIV, which actually inserts those genes literally into your genome, you could actually get a gene that HIV stole from like a chimpanzee by accident. You could get that embedded into you, I suppose. That could happen if you're eating raw chimp meat or something. So that can happen. It's not really considered to be evolutionarily significant, though. We don't think it happens all that much, but horizontal gene transfer does happen quite a bit through other avenues. Martin Henning asks, our computer code has design strategies like automatic error correction built into it, but how did automatic error correction in DNA evolve? So there are lots of organisms, really simple organisms that don't really have that sort of thing. And most organisms do have something like that. But these would have just evolved as early adaptations to help organisms survive and reproduce better. So, if a mutation rate is too high, that can be bad for an organism. If it's too low, it can be bad for an organism as well. So over evolutionary time, anything that happens to help, tune that mutation rate into an appropriate mutation rate will be selected for. So yeah, it would have started with nothing, and then you would have slowly, gradually evolved one by one different mechanisms for this to happen until you have the full-blown, really advanced error correction systems that exist in the human genome. And these would have been essential first steps before the evolution of animals even. So before you could get really complex evolution, complex organisms require pretty low mutation rates, were easy to break through mutations. So before something like this could evolve, you'd have to have the evolution of error correction. And that's what we see if we look at, even sponges, they have really advanced error correction systems. And then if we look at the relatives to sponges, they also have pretty advanced correction systems and so on. So it would have evolved gradually, like pretty much everything else. Are there life forms that don't need water to live? No. Not that we know of. Everything requires water. That DNA and RNA, they require water to be suspended inside the cell. So you cannot live without water. There's lots of animals that can survive long periods without water. They can actually dry up. So the tardy bears can dry up. You can completely dry them out. And then you rehydrate them and they come back to life. But you cannot have active, replication and transcription and all that without water. What are your thoughts on artificial selection? Well, I have lots of thoughts on artificial selection. What specifically would you like to know? If you comment there, I'll give you some more detail. How and why did virus evolve anyway? Whose idea was that? There's multiple origin hypotheses for viruses in the first place, and it's probably multiple hypotheses are actually correct. One is that viruses represent primitive life forms before cells had evolved. It's unlikely that most viruses stretch back that far, but I guess it's possible that some might. Another possibility is that they actually are escaped genes from cells, and that's most likely. I mean, the vast majority of them probably are escaped genes from cells. I talked earlier today about how so many of our genes are fighting with each other. Like there's all sorts of chaos in our genomes. You can actually get genes that will escape and form, new little organisms. It actually happens. It hasn't been observed, though, the evolution of a new virus. That has not been observed. What has been observed is the evolution of single-celled organisms from multi-celled organisms. We have this happening in dogs, you could say. They have a transmissible cancer. And then you have it really obviously in Tasmanian devils. They have a cancer that they can transfer to each other. So it's a single cell, it's a colonial organism that when they bite each other, if they have it, they can actually transfer it to another Tasmanian devil. It'll get it. It really should be thought of as its own organism. It originated as a cancer cell, but it's its own organism. And from these, we can just, it's obvious that this could also happen at the level of viruses, where instead of cells escaping and creating their own thing, you could have groups of genes escaping and creating their own thing. So that's the most likely origin of most of the viruses that we find around us today. If someone called humans biological robots that have no free will, would that be a true statement? It depends on how you define free will, I suppose, and robot. But I mean, for all practical reasons, it's safe to say that, we have will, we have agency, and we can take each other's agency away. It's something that's important to us, but I think if you zoom in close enough, agency does go away, or free will does sort of disappear, in the same way that if you zoom into a table enough, the table disappears and all you see is the atoms. If you zoom into the human mind close enough, the ability to choose seems to melt away and you just see all these like local interactions that are happening. And I think, you could say that means that free will doesn't exist, I guess, but that's depends on how you want to think about it. Is the pug an abomination? Sione asks. No, Sione, the pug is beautiful. Cybug says, hello, Cybugs. Drop a question. if you got one. And it is now 10:30, so yeah, I think I want to kind of wrap it up. But if you got any more questions, let me know. Here, I've got enough. My drink's not over, so we'll do another 10 minutes. Stated clearly, will you make a speculative evolution series, please? Darren Naish is the guy to go learn about speculative evolution from. He does it on his podcast sometimes. He talks about it. Yeah, it hasn't been something I've been super interested in, but it's kind of fun to think of what sorts of things could evolve under different situations. And there's a video on Netflix right now. I can't remember what it's called, but they go and they do speculative evolution on other planets that might exist in the solar system. That's really cool. So there's some really good stuff already. I'm not super interested in it. I probably won't do it. But yeah, Darren Naish does that. He talks about it a lot. And then there's this Netflix series. What are your opinions on kin selection theory? So kin selection is the idea that we are selected not only for our own survival and reproduction, but for the survival and reproduction of those that share genes with us. So our inclusive fitness. Natural selection is maximizing inclusive fitness. It never fully maximizes inclusive fitness, but it is, it's pushing us towards the maximization of inclusive fitness. And yeah, I think that's one of the best ways to think about evolution. It is spot on. The things we're able to predict because of kin selection theory, it's amazing. And that, of course, is the hallmark of a good piece of theory, is that it actually, makes good predictions and leads us to new discoveries, and kin selection has done that time and time again. There are people who say that multi-level selection is another way to go about it and is better in some circumstances. That might be true in some circumstances, but in all the cases that I've found, kin selection works best and it's sufficient. But yeah, there are other ways to think about evolution and to even measure it and model it mathematically. So multi-level selection theories, various different theories exist that try and do the same thing from a different angle. I'm not going to say that they're wrong, but the kin selection does work. Since this is Darwin Day, do you have any fun story about him? My anthro professor had a nice lecture about his grandfather, Erasmus, book Zoonomia, where he describes a flock of birds. I actually don't have cute stories about Darwin, actually. I mean, there's one where he put a beetle in his mouth and it scored him with a chemical. I guess that's kind of cool. He was collecting beetles and his hands were full, so he started putting them inside of his mouth. That's how much of a crazy person he was when it came to studying biology, caring about, investigating wildlife. Nancy Cybugs, she adds onto the question about kin selection. It also explains the evolution of eusocial insects as individuals and superorganisms. Yeah. Our DNA is long. How can it replicate so rapidly? Based on sheer number and of nucleotides, the time span should be much greater than the few minutes to hours in which it replicates. Any thoughts? It does feel like it should. It feels like it should happen much slower. But the way that our DNA is replicated, there's it happens at multiple spots at once. So, there's multitasking happening. And also things at the chemical level happen way, way, way faster than you would think. It's insane how quick chemical reactions are. And so these enzymes that replicate DNA, they are working incredibly quickly. And when I first started learning about how fast our chemical reactions are inside of our bodies, it just blew me away. But if you think about it, our brains are working on top of the chemical reactions that are happening inside of our cells. And so our speed of thought is actually determined by the speed of the chemical reactions happening inside of our cells. So of course, when we look at how fast these reactions happen, it blows our minds how quickly they happen, because we are slow, lumbering, chemical systems, right? The speed by which we can comprehend the speed of a chemical reaction is based on the chemical reactions that are happening in our brain. That's the set point. So it's not too surprising when you realize that everything, all these chemical reactions seem like they're happening too fast. It's not that they're happening too fast, it's that we're slow. Martin asks, do you think we will be able to build biological computers with the DNA code that are much faster than our computers? How fast does the DNA code execute instructions? Well, there are certain types of calculations that living things can do better than like the classic Turing computers. One of those is, biological systems can perform, it's the traveling salesman equations. They can perform those linearly, whereas our computers, it takes exponential time. So the more complex the problem is, the more exponential power is needed for our normal computers to do it. Whereas in biology, it's linear. And we have designed computers based on that can actually do this equation linearly. They're analog computers. It's really cool. But so we can borrow things from biology, but as far as actually just using DNA and protein encoding and stuff to actually be the computer, I've never really thought about how that might work. I know in Star Trek Voyager they do that. They have the neural gel packs or something. I can't remember what they call them, but they're part of the computer, and it performs certain equations faster than the rest of the computer can perform. And that's something that we would see. We could definitely exploit the certain things that biology is better at than our typical computers, and we could build hybrids with them. That would be interesting. But as far as a computer like the computers that we normally use, like that runs your laptop or your cell phone, I think the way that we're building them right now is the best way to build them. It's not always going to be the best way to build them, but it's better than using DNA, using biology. Let's see. Do you know of any studies that follow up those old studies about synthetic RNA, like the famous Spiegelman's monster? Don't know if I'm writing that properly. Are you talking about RNA evolution experiments? Because there's a really good review of those. It's called 40 Years of In Vitro Evolution, and it's just an overview of 40 years of RNA evolution experiments. That's really cool. So you just take a chain of RNA, a bunch of random chains of RNA, and you take an enzyme that can replicate them, and then you give them some sort of a task. So if they can attach to this molecule, you put a bunch of this particular molecule in the solution, and then you have some sort of mechanism that allows you to pull out that molecule after you let the chains of RNA replicate for a few generations. And then you take what you've pulled out and you put that in another solution, and you let the chains of RNA evolve in there, and then you pull it out again using that same molecule. And what you get is you get chains of RNA that are really good at attaching to this one specific molecule, and they become super, super good at it. I mean, they're amazing at attaching to this molecule, and they fight each other to be the first to, attach to this molecule to make sure that they get replicated. So that, yeah, they're not doing anything intentionally. They evolve this ability. So that's these RNA evolution experiments are really cool. We've actually evolved medicines that way. There's a medicine that was used for a long time in the eye for onset blindness for old people that was evolved with RNA. It was a chain of RNA that evolved in one of these experiments. It's super cool. We now use some protein for it now that also works and is cheaper to produce. Like I said earlier, RNA is very fragile. It's hard to keep. So we have a protein now that works better for this medicine, but it's cool that we actually had an evolved medicine that was being used. Cybug. So Nancy from Cybug, she says, Darwin hated marine lizards and thought they were demon lizards. Wait, he thought they were literally thought they were demons, or just thought they looked like demons do in demon art? We coded a book into DNA, but it takes forever to decode. Yeah, so you can actually you can use the genetic code to store normal digital information because it works digitally, right? But yeah, it's hard to then access that information. But I suppose if we spent a lot of time working on DNA computers, you would have DNA computers that worked faster. People confuse the DNA code versus computer code and use this for arguments for intelligent design. Can you clarify what code means for DNA? When we're talking about the genetic code, we're talking about the codon chart. So the list of codons, the 3 nucleotide snippets of DNA that code for a specific amino acid in the amino acid chart. So that's all we're talking about when we talk about the genetic code. I actually have a whole lecture on this that I did. I just did a debate on, is the genetic code a code? And it is a code. It is a code similar to computer code, but it's similar. If you were to compare them to each other, you'd have to compare machine code to genetic code. So things like ASCII code, not things like JavaScript or Java or C++ coding languages. DNA doesn't have this coding languages like computers do. But we do have there is this symbol-based coding system at the heart of biology that really it works similar to the code charts that you would find when you're looking up ASCII codes and so on. But yeah, there's a video. I'll try and I'll put a link to it in this video once I'm done broadcasting this video. I'll put a link to that discussion because I have a bunch of slides and I explain exactly what the similarities and differences are between the genetic code and computer code. Okay, let's see. Nancy from Cybug says, he called them demons. I should find you the quote. It's hilarious. He calls them ugly and slow. Cool. What's he hating on them for? They're awesome. All right, I think I'm going to wrap it up now. Let's see if there's one more. Yeah, well, I'm getting some nice messages. Thank you for the feedback, Andrew. And I got one last question, the final question that I will answer hopefully I didn't miss any of your questions, folks. I apologize if I did. Is do you think you will still be the same person if your brain was uploaded to a robot body in a computer brain? Because your body is also a part of who you are. I guess that depends on how faithful the model is to your actual body, I suppose. I mean, hypothetically, you could build a perfect replica of someone. I mean, information is substrate independent, and the information in your brain should be substrate independent as well. But you'd have to make everything work the same in a new scenario. So maybe someday, but right now there's no way that could possibly work. We don't understand how the brain works well enough to even simulate a brain, let alone simulate a specific person's brain. And so, yeah, I would say that for now, certainly the answer is no. And probably, you and I will probably die way before anything like that is worth trying. So, sucks to be us, I guess, if you happen to be a person that wants to live forever. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. This was fun. And yeah, next, I'm going to try and do these every Darwin Day. So I'll do a thing on the Stated Clearly channel and a follow-up on the Stated Casually channel. I have done things in the past on Darwin Day on both channels, but I'm trying to hone in on doing it like this every year. This was fun. And my idea from this came from the fact that I was stuck at home. I couldn't go out and do a speech. I tried to, I've done speeches, and the last big one I did was, I think, 3 years ago in South Carolina. That was a lot of fun. And I do have a copy of that talk on the Stated Casually channel, so you can find that. I think it's called What is Chemical Evolution or something, or Did Life Evolve from Chemicals? That's what it's called. So, yeah. So long for now. Stay curious.